guys named after them, so learning all this. John Whalen not here. Patty McQuillan, is that right? McEwen, sorry. David Weiss.
Here.
And Kyle Williams.
Here.
And then city administration, Sally, and so everybody, and then do we need to list them down there as well?
I don't think so. This is
Just a
actually a
workshop.
workshop, not a formal
Okay.
meeting, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was gonna make a point of order for, do we need to take minutes on this?
It's a workshop and it will be recorded,
It's all
so.
public, so
Okay.
Yep. Okay. All right, you ready for us to jump in?
we are ready.
You are ready, okay.
Yeah, ready.
All right, so Stacy will actually be doing most of the talking this evening, but I'm gonna start off with the introduction to the budget. So those will be your first several pages in the packet. So fiscal year 2026 budget that we're looking over tonight. So this is the first look at it. So presented before you, even though it needs a few tweaks, we're looking at a balanced fiscal year 2026 budget. Fiscal year 2026 is a $29 million budget. So last year was 25 million, and we'll talk about it here in a bit. A lot of that, the big reasons for that are some of these grant funded, these really large projects, and they kind of have kept rolling forward. We're getting closer and closer to the deadline, so a lot of them will be wrapping up here within this year or next year. So that is an increase in 17% from the previous budget. And so, just like I mentioned, when looking at expenditures, not including inflationary and other factors noted later, grant-funded projects account for most of the increase between the current estimated year-end and this new budget. Total expenditures on grant-funded projects is roughly 10.4 million. Okay. On the revenue side, increases in revenues are largely accounted for by the increase in grant revenues, many of which have rolled over from previous years, as I stated. Okay, so 2026 reserve funds and transfers. So this slide will be in here every year, okay? These are 4 types of transfers between funds that occur with every budget year, okay? Transfers from operating funds to reserve funds, okay? Reserve goals are 25% of the previous year's operating expense for each fund. Yes, the OCRAP fund. Right? We've relied heavily on those this past year, so we're really glad we have them. The second type of transfer is from operating funds to depreciation and replacement funds. So that's for repair and replacement of vehicles, equipment, sometimes large infrastructure. We've not got that fully in place yet, but we're working on it. So how that works, if a reserve goal is met, the 25%, then a minimum of 5% of the previous year's operating expense goes to that DNR, depreciation and replacement fund. The third kind are general fund transfers to funds without independent or sufficient revenue. So examples of that are the cemetery, the building permits, building inspections, and economic development. So those are some examples that don't have an independent revenue stream. And then there's the 5% royalty fee transferred from the electric fund to the general fund. Okay, so that's a transfer that happens every year. So then next is this is the copy of our reserve fund policy. Okay. Again, that'll be in there every year, just as a reminder. This is something that I would like for this group to look at some point and see if we need to make any tweaks to it, if you think we should have tweaks. When you talk about the OCRAP funds, the reserve funds that we just talked about, like I said, we have relied heavily on those this year with the flooding that happened in November, that we're working through the FEMA process to get reimbursed. They'll reimburse up to 75% of those funds we expend to recover from that. But we used that fund down to 20,000 roughly, 21,000 this year on our sewer fund. So doesn't mean we have to make adjustments, but just something to keep in mind. We've used from the sewer reserve fund this year. We've used from the water reserve fund when our primary water well was struck by lightning. So it's been, they have been used, and very grateful that those were in place. Let's see. So anyway, just something to think about if those 25% amounts are appropriate. One other thing to think about, this came from the firm that was doing a rate study for us for electric utilities. They recommended, they didn't do it in the meeting, the utility meeting, but they recommended in conversations with Stacy and I that we look at if we need to deplete that fund, we use it because we have an emergency, what's the mechanism by which we replace it? Do we want to wait and do only 5% every year? Or do we want to get that back in place sooner in case something else happens? And so what's that mechanism, okay? So those are some things to kind of think about as we move forward. Moving on. Okay, previous year's balances. In the budget before you, there are 5 instances. So again, remember, this is a draft budget. Nothing is set in stone. Things are still preliminary, and I will say we still have more committee meetings to wrap up and review their portions of the budget. So this is draft. But right now we have 5 instances where we are pulling previous year's ending balances, not used, go into prior year fund balances, okay? And so there are times, like I said, 5 instances in this budget where we pull from those previous year funds to try to balance the budget. So one example, the Parks Improvement Fund, at this point is planning to repave the T-ball fields, the parking lot for their T-ball fields. And so that is a price tag of about $220,000. And so, again, proposing that we pull from prior year funds to do that, to do a portion of that at least. The airport fund is presented as using $43,000 from the previous year's balance. Again, that board has not met yet to go over their budget. And those two specifically do not have reserve funds, okay, parks and airport. And then when we get into utilities, the electric utility is budgeted, at least we're moving forward with this recommendation, and this was a recommendation from Capital Improvements Committee on Tuesday night, instead of leasing a bucket truck, purchasing one. So that will obviously have to pull from prior year funds. And then on April 23rd, the Utility Committee voted to recommend the use of a portion of the water funds, prior year funds, that in addition to raising rates in an effort to cover rehabilitation, really the big ticket item is the rehabilitation of the Industrial Park Water Tower, okay? And then the sewer funds. So this past year, we were incurring costs toward the upgrades and toward Phase 2B, which is the bond-funded portion of the upgrades. But we didn't have the bond in place yet, but we had expenses that we were needing to pay. So we took out a preliminary bond, okay, to cover between that time and when the bond gets in place, when the bond closes. And so when we roll over the budget year, that will look like prior year fund balance, okay, because it's coming from this budget year. It'll carry over as a prior year fund balance, but it was specifically intended for those expenses that will incur before the bond closes. So those are the instances, like I said, prior year fund balances. And if you guys have questions, please stop me anytime, okay? Okay, so increases budget-wide. Very few this year. And they all actually have to do with employees, okay? So the past 2 years, we have done a 3% cost of living and a 2% merit raise. At this time, looking at the budget, we have reduced that to a 2%. Now, I do base that COLA, that cost of living increase, on the Consumer Product Index, and it is at 2%, 2.1% as of April for the past 12 months, okay? So that's where that cost of living increase comes from, and then the 1% merit for those whose merit evaluations warrant it. The other piece is pay scale true-ups. We will go into detail on that just a few more slides down, okay? Okay, so there were a few assumptions that we had to make as we were putting this budget together, okay? So these first 4 items, actually all of them, relate to staffing and employee retention, okay? So approval of the new employee health insurance proposal. I have a slide in here for that, but it has last year's information. We don't have the updated information yet. So we just have last year's numbers plugged in the budget for the time being. Pay schedule adjustments. Last year we adjusted 2 positions. They didn't have separate job descriptions and they really needed to be broken out. So we did 2 pay scale adjustments for those 2 positions last year. We have multiples this year. Cost of living adjustments, we had to assume the 2%, merit raises, and then proposing a change of the animal care coordinator. So at our animal shelter, we have two positions. We have our animal control officer, and then we have a part-time animal control coordinator who helps out. So looking at moving that position from a part-time to a full-time position. Okay. And again, we'll discuss these in more detail here in just a moment. Okay, so as we get into them, so this is the first one. This is the healthcare. Like I said, we don't have new numbers for this yet. One thing of note about the third bullet point, it says about the employee short-term disability that the city covers the cost of. When we did that, it was $12,000 for the year with the 2-year rate guarantee. So this will be the first year that rate guarantee falls off. So we don't know what that will look like this year either, okay? But like I said, the rest of that is last year's info. Okay, item 2, pay scale adjustments. Okay. So we have 4 positions that, with the changes in the state minimum wage, so minimum wage is at, I think, $13.75 right now. January 1st, which is middle of our budget year, it will go up to $15 an hour. So we have 4 positions that we will need to adjust that pay scale to stay in line with that minimum wage. Now, technically, the city is exempt. We don't have to follow the state's minimum wage. We have so far been following that every year as it increases so that we stay competitive, you know, and hoping that we can attract quality people. So, and then the second item on an adjustment, so we created, so the animal control officer, the pay scale has historically been based on an animal control position. With changing that animal care coordinator from part-time to full-time, we are looking at shifting the animal control officer to being half animal control officer, half code compliance, code enforcement. And code enforcement is generally at a higher pay scale. So this is a blend 50-50 of those 2 pay scales. So that's a change in that pay scale that you will see, okay? All right, so under pay scale adjustments, continued. Okay, this is a long, I'm not going to read it to you, okay? This is the methodology that I use to adjust the pay scale. And I'll give you the quick Cliff Notes version. The Missouri Municipal League, or League of Cities, does a wage and salary survey every year. So I have every year requested that. 2 years ago when I first stepped into this position, and then again this year, I looked at every position that we have that they have data for in that survey. And I sort by size of cities, and I look at cities between 4,000 and 5,000 to get a comparable cities. I then throw out, this year, I threw out the known unionized cities because wages are vastly different than ours. I also throw out the highest paying city and the lowest paying city. Okay. I use the remaining ones and develop an average for that position. And I line it up, and you'll see here in the next slides, with step 5, which is midline for our pay scale. So then I do one more step. We know we live in somewhat of a depressed area economically, so I take the counties those cities are in that I can get average wage numbers for from the state. You can't get them for cities, but you can get county average wages. I then compare those to Dent County's wages and see what that percentage change is between the two, and I apply that to that average pay for each city, or for each position. Does that make sense? The averaged salary from all the cities, I apply that percentage for Dent County. So it's a locally adjusted wage, okay? So that's the short Cliff Notes version, okay? Okay, so the next 2 slides are the actual pay scale. Okay, yes. So the items in green, I think you guys have black and white copies, so up here on the screen, green, yellowish green, however they show up there, those are the 4 positions I mentioned that are adjusted up due to the minimum wage increase. Okay? Now, there is one line, and my apologies because it's really faint. I was hoping it would show up better. The dispatcher has two lines. There's one in green, and the one below it should be in a tan. That is the wage-adjusted pay scale for dispatchers, okay? Both of those pay scales are higher than what we currently have. And you'll see that Dent County, over on the far right-hand side in the pink up here, 85% is what Dent County's wages are compared to the other comparable cities and counties' wages. So that pink or tan line for dispatcher is that adjusted pay scale. You guys following me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so everywhere where you see two of the same position, the bottom one is that wage adjusted, okay? So some of these are relatively significant adjustments. Last time we adjusted the pay scale, I think we had one employee that was impacted that kind of fell off the bottom, and we did a pay increase to get them back on. We have, and I didn't write that down, we have several this year that would fall off the bottom of the pay scale if this adjusted pay scale is approved, okay? So you see the entire city's pay scale broke out in that way. The two items in yellow, the supervisor and the corporal, the municipal league did not have wage data for those two positions, which I thought was interesting. So I have kind of extrapolated based on the other data for positions in those departments to come up with that pay scale. And so, yeah, just a quick reminder, just because the pay scale adjusts doesn't automatically mean the employee's pay adjusts, is only if they fall off the pay scale.
So Sally, I think that what you've shown us here it's clear. It makes a lot of sense for
Yeah, talking to,
my,
sorry.
my arm. Can you hear me?
Oh, you can hear her out
I
there?
can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, click it the other way.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it needs to be
There you
pushed
go.
up,
Just
yeah.
like that.
Yeah, I was up.
Make sure you're talking directly into the mic, though.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so let me back up. So I think this is clear, so thank you. And given the other positions that we were talking about, where, for instance, the merit becomes 1% for the next year.
Right.
So, given what we've done this year, has there been a retention issue? And do you foresee a concern going forward?
I don't think so. Obviously, some positions are harder to keep than others. But as a whole, I don't feel like there's been a major retention issue. I mean, we've had some staff leave, but I don't feel like it's a major issue.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Anything else on this piece? Like I said, the next slide is just the continuation, the bottom half of the pay scale, so you'll see all of that broken out. Let me know when you guys are ready to move on.
I'm good.
You're good? Okay. So then, just a little more explanation. I think I've already mentioned this, the cost of living adjustment. I do base that on the Consumer Price Index. And that's specifically for the St. Louis area, and that's 2%, 2.1, so 2% over the previous 12 months. I do pull that from the Department of Labor, okay? Or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, sorry. So then community comparisons, so kind of the bottom part of this slide. I've been including some of this data in the past just so that everybody can kind of see where we compare. So the average City of Salem employee wage, and I need to update that date. It should be 6/2025. But for as of right now, the average City of Salem employee wage is $36,850. That's an increase of 3% from last year. Okay. The median wage is $37,107. The average Dent County wage through the end of June is $38,844. That's from the Missouri Department of Economic Development. And of course, that's the number I used to adjust the pay scale with. The average household income in Salem, there's been a lot of talk about this in the last few months, per the Census Bureau is $53,198. That's the average household income. And then I can go through these others, they're all there. If anyone has questions, please let me know. I did cite references and where I pulled those numbers from. Okay? But just so you can kind of see how it compares to our area. Okay, merit raises. As I mentioned, 1% total is what's proposed. We are now performing merit evals annually and based upon the employee's performance. So an employee could get an extra 0.5% or an extra full 1%, depending on how they score on their evaluation. So they could get nothing extra, they could just get the 2% COLA, or they could get 2.5%, or they can get 3% based on performance. Okay. Now, one thing of note, we have talked among staff, and at least in our conversations to date, we were talking our timing of when merit happens and when COLA happens. Last year, we started out with COLA happening July 1st, kind of beginning of the year. We have talked about switching that starting this year. The reason for that is with the minimum wage adjusting, the law states that it'll go to 15 this January, and thereafter it will adjust by the CPI, which is what I use to determine COLA, each year thereafter. So we talked about switching the COLA raises to January 1st, so it'll be in line with that minimum wage increase. Instead of some employees get it this time, the others get it 6 months later. So in discussions last year with staff, instead of doing merit on employees or anniversary dates, we switched that to 6 months after the COLA. So we would be looking at July 1 for merit increases and January 1 for COLA increases. Okay. So we've already kind of discussed the proposed change in staffing about the animal shelter. That needs to be the care coordinator from part-time to full-time, which would then free up the animal control officer to shift to half of his time being code enforcement. Okay. So points to consider. Once again, tonight, this is a balanced budget with the exceptions and assumptions noted previously. This is the second year of reducing dependency on transfers from the electric utility. Okay, that was kind of something that was the big promotional piece when we were pushing for the additional 1% sales tax a couple years ago, and so we are in our second year of that actually being a reality in the budget. Okay. Or at least this will be the second year. This is also the second year of setting funds aside for that repair and replacement fund for vehicles and equipment. I put a note in here, though. It is a bit of a struggle, and this year is a struggle. You know, we've reduced COLA, we've reduced raises, but to fully fund that repair and replacement fund is a struggle. We still are putting money aside in the budget, as you'll see as we move through it, but it's to fully fund it is a bit of a task. But we want to do that to the best of our ability so that when it comes time, we're not having to lease vehicles, we're not having to finance them. And so as a cost-saving long-term measure. Then the sewer bond, approved by voters in April of '23, should close before September. That's what we're hoping for. If it doesn't, we start losing grant funding, okay? So we are doing everything possible to make sure that happens. It's required by the state revolving fund that we review and adjust rates each year as necessary on the sewer rates. So we do anticipate additional operational costs once the construction of the upgrades is complete. There will be additional chemical costs that we don't incur now. There will be some additional costs such as those. So just something to note moving forward. Okay. And then that's all I have for the introduction. So if you guys have questions for me, I'm more than happy to answer. Otherwise, I'll pass it off to Ms. Stacy to go through the budget itself.
I'm good.
Good for me, thank you.
No.
Push it up. You're off right now.
Can you hear me? Sorry. Okay, So this is a list of all of the city's funds. There are several. The city uses fund accounting, which is used to track the amount of cash assigned to different purposes. Some of these funds are restricted funds, which means that they can only be used for that fund's purpose. As you can see, some of these funds have little to no activity, so we will only be looking at our major funds that have activities. This report shows by fund the estimated beginning balance to start the new budget year. The next two columns show the proposed budgeted revenues and expenditures. The next two columns show the transfers in and out. So the transfers are transfers between funds. The far right column shows the proposed ending balance for each fund. So if you look at the bottom totals, it shows that we anticipate to start the fiscal year at 13 million. Total revenues at 27 million, expenditures 26 million. Then the far right column totals of all funds are at 13 million. So when we look at revenues, because Sally had mentioned this is a $29 million budget, you have to add the budgeted revenues plus the budgeted transfers. So that's what makes up the actual revenues on the actual budget. So, okay, next slide. Okay, so for the fiscal year 26, revenues less expenditures, we have budgeted the year with a surplus of $934,000, which is the bottom line there. And then if you look at the third line down, is what we budgeted for the current fiscal year. We are projecting to end this fiscal year quite a bit less than what we had budgeted. That is because there are several grant projects that we thought we would be further along with than what we are. For fiscal year 26, revenues and expenditures have significantly increased, as Sally had already discussed. That is because of the grant projects we have in place. And the next slide shows all the grants that we have. So this is all the grants we currently have in place. The last three on the list here has not been actually awarded to us yet, but we're hoping to, hear something pretty soon on all of those. So does anyone have any questions about the grants or want to know what the grants are for? I know we've talked about them a lot in different meetings, but.
I don't have any questions about the grants.
Okay. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so the city collects a total of 2% sales tax for the general fund. 1% took effect in 1980, then voters approved an additional 1% in 2023. The city has seen a strong, consistent upward trend in sales tax revenues. And for this fiscal year, we're pretty well keeping the projections flat, not knowing exactly what the economy is going to do. We've been seeing an increase, but we went ahead and just kept it flat for this upcoming budget year. Okay. So I try to list out all the budget highlights within the general fund. I don't want to go through all of these line by line unless you all want to. But just some notable changes I do want to discuss. So revenues, the projections, increase in sales tax revenue is $182,000. This was under budgeted in fiscal year 25, so I have projected the fiscal year 26 to be pretty much what we anticipate to bring in for 25. As the previous slide showed, it was pretty flat. So, and then also in fiscal year 25, the other sources, which is a transfer in, decreased $581,000 of prior year funds. That is because prior year funds was used to move to the general fund reserve account, and that shows up as a revenue. And then on expenditures, proposing, as Sally already discussed, proposing an increase in salaries, the 2% cost of living, 1% merit, and then the pay scale true-up for those employees. Then also on general liability insurance, you will see some of the departments have significant increases and decreases. This is due to reallocation of the expense for property and vehicles to the correct departments. So the insurance had sent us a itemized list of all of our equipment. So I just went through and made sure we were allocating to the correct departments. And so that's why you're gonna see some will have a significant increase in general liability, some's gonna have a decrease. The animal control court enforcement, proposing to move the part-time animal care coordinator position to full-time. On the street department, Sally didn't mention this one, but it's been decided to split the full-time cemetery position with the streets department, so that during slow periods, primarily in the winter months, this employee will assist with the street department duties to maximize efficiency and make better use of available staffing resources. On the administration non-departmental, we have $100,000 budgeted for financial software upgrades. If this is approved, we would like to explore options to changing out our computer software that we currently use. And then on the police department, $100,000 is plugged in for 2 new patrol cars. That's a lot, so if anyone has any specific questions on any of those items, I try to pull out anything of large amounts that is changing from last budget year to the current budget year.
It all looks like it makes sense to me, so.
Nothing for me.
Yep. Okay, so this is just an overall total of the general fund revenue and expenditures. On all of these financial slides, you will see that the first column there is fiscal years. The first and second column is the fiscal years 23 and 24 actuals. Then the third column is what we have budgeted for this current year. Then the next column is what we projected to end this current year. And then the next to last column there is the draft budget. And then the very last column is the changes between the current fiscal year and the draft budget. So the significant changes were on the budget highlighted that we just looked at. Then there under other sources, transfer from electric is the 5% royalty. So the other sources and other uses, that's the transfers in and transfers out. And I've noted at the bottom on what exactly is in those totals. So you'll see those broke out there for you. And then, any questions on that slide? We'll go into more detail on the next slides. Okay, and this is just a breakout of all the revenue sources that the general fund has. Sales tax is the largest revenue source for the general fund. For revenues, we anticipate ending the fiscal year at just under 4.6 million. We have in the draft budget total revenues at 3.9 million. The decrease is due to the one-time transfer to the general reserve fund in this current fiscal year, where we won't have that in the draft budget. And then on the next,
If I might
go
explain
ahead.
that,
Yep, go
Stacy
ahead.
was just talking about that transfer. Last year was the first year that we funded, this was not the reserves, but the DNR, right?
No, that was actually the reserve,
okay.
the emergency fund that we
Yeah, last budget year, the current budget year is the first year we fully funded those. So the decision was made last year, especially for the general fund budget, to fully fund the reserve, or that OCRAP account. We simply pulled from prior year funds. And so that transferring technically looks like a revenue stream. So that's why that this next year's revenue projections are lower. Okay.
Got it.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so the next 2 slides are just a detailed breakout of those revenue categories. And we'll skip through those unless you all want to look in detail at those items. Again, any significant changes that you see there on the right should have been on that first slide we looked at on the notable changes. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so this is a summary of the general fund expenditures. We have several departments within the general fund, with the police department being the largest department, so they have the most expenses, and then the street department being the next largest. Overall, general fund expenditures, we anticipate to end the fiscal year '25 with almost 3.3 million. Fiscal year '26 draft budget at 3.6 million. The budget highlights and notable changes were on the previous slides again. But we can go back and look at those at any time if you want to. But the next several slides, there's like, the next 19 slides are all the details for each department and each category. So if there's a specific department you want to look at.
I mean, I've been looking at these numbers pretty much every month. These are, and, I mean, you're not changing the budget terribly much from what it was. It's all staying, it shows more just because of the grants, but it's roughly the same. Is there anything you guys were wanting to look at, any department in particular?
Okay.
I got a quick question.
Well, there's page numbers on mine.
Okay, I have one quick
Yeah.
question.
Oh, go ahead.
So in terms of general fund expenses, since that's kind of a big encompassing thing, do prior year funds for different subsections of that department go into prior year funds for those things, or just into general fund in?
Just into general fund.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I was
One
curious.
big pool.
One bit, yeah, so it's one pool there. Okay.
Yeah, so we don't have like a specific police prior year funds or streets
Yeah,
prior year
that's what I was
funds.
curious
Right,
on, was
right.
if
One
there
large.
was a separate one for that versus animal control or something else. Okay.
So where do I need to go?
If you scroll down just a little bit, I've got page numbers on mine.
Right.
At the top right, so it'd be page number 31.
They're not gonna
No,
correlate with
they
this
don't.
though.
No,
Okay, so I don't know.
go down like 15 slides.
You said it's page
So-
31.
Yes.
How about we try this?
Getting closer.
Figured that would get us close. Where's the link? All right, Stacy.
Getting
That
closer.
was more than 15 pages.
Actually, it's 19, I think.
19? Wow.
One more.
There we go.
Okay. So this,
Page 31,
yes.
yeah.
So this is the replacement fund for the general fund. Funds are transferred from the operating fund to this fund for future vehicle replacements and major building repairs. For the draft budget, we are transferring $455,000 from the operating fund to this fund. So if you look at the very bottom of some of the slides, you'll see the beginning fund balance. So at the beginning fund balance at the beginning of this draft budget is $608,000. So after the budget year, the proposed budget year, will be $965,000. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're moving into the special street fund. These are items that were on the capital improvement plan. $120,000 was for street pavements, and then we have the lease payment for a skid steer. Next page. Okay, so this is a summary of the Special Streets Fund. The source of revenue comes from a gas tax, sales tax, and vehicles and vehicle fees. This is a restricted fund that can only be used for street maintenance and equipment for street maintenance. We anticipate ending the fiscal year with a surplus of $73,000. For the '26 draft budget, we would end the year with a surplus of $119,000. So any questions on the Special Streets Fund?
Nope.
the next two slides, I believe, are just the details within each category. There's not a whole lot in special street fund. Okay, moving to the Parks and Rec Fund. The city does collect a 3/8 cent sales tax to be used for local parks of the city. The city has, again, seen strong, consistent upward trends in sales tax revenues, but we're gonna keep it flat in the proposed budget. Okay, next slide. So just some notable changes within the Parks and Rec Fund. Increase in sales tax revenues, again, just as into the general fund, I just under budgeted in fiscal year 25, so I'm truing that up for fiscal year 26. And then the pool is expected to be open this year. So we should see the full year's worth of revenues and expenditures. So all those revenues and expense lines that deal with the pool you'll see an increase on those. Okay, any questions on any of those items?
Nope.
Okay. Okay, and then these are the projects that were on the capital improvement plan. Didn't know if you want to talk about those. We kind of looked at them the other night at the capital improvement meeting. Do want to note that the park board has not reviewed their budget, so they will be reviewing and approving these items along with their budget at their meeting. Okay. Okay, so this is the summary slide for the Parks and Rec Fund. So along with the sales tax, they also bring in revenues for charges for service, which are the pool receipts and fees for the sports programs. This is a restricted fund, so it can only be used for park-related expenses. For the current fiscal year, there is currently a deficit of $195,000 for this fiscal year. It has been approved by the Park Board and the Board of Aldermen to use prior year funds to balance this budget. This was due to expenses that has occurred due to the flooding in November. We have submitted claims to FEMA, so we are hoping to get part of it reimbursed. In the draft budget, currently there is a deficit of $32,000. So the park board will need to decide where to cut expenses or if they want to pull from their prior year funds again. Then if there's no questions, the next 5 slides will be the details within each category.
Anything that you
Yeah.
would like to look at?
No. Next one, right here. Okay, moving into the building inspector fund. There's not much change to his budget, but the budget highlights, you'll see a decrease in revenues and expenditures, and that is due to an insurance check that we received and paid out. We have a program that when a structure within the city burns, we receive 25% of the homeowner's insurance proceeds until the property is deemed safe and is not a hazard. Once that is done, we then reissue the check to the homeowner. So that's basically the only major changes to his budget. And each year, I never know if we're gonna get a check or not, so it may change. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the source of revenue comes from permits and license fees. These revenues are not sufficient to cover all expenses, so a transfer from the general fund is required to balance this budget. The current fiscal year is projected to end with a surplus of $8,000. For the fiscal year 26 draft budget, we have a reduction in, as I already said, reduction in the revenues and expenditures for that one-time payment. And then for the fiscal year 26 budget, this budget is balanced, showing neither a surplus nor a deficit. And then the next 2 slides is the details within this fund. Okay, moving on to the capital improvement fund. The source of revenue comes from a half-cent sales tax, and then we also get grant revenues. This fund is restricted, so it can only be used for capital improvement expenditures. And again, the city continues to see a strong, consistent upward trend in sales tax revenues, but have decided to keep it flat for this proposed budget. Next slide. Okay, so this is all the projects in the capital improvement plan that will be funded out of this capital improvement fund. We had, as I said, we had the committee workshop earlier this week, and they've had the opportunity to review, ask questions about these projects. But do any of you have any questions about any of the projects that we have listed?
I do.
Okay.
I've got 2 questions on this slide. The first one is the improvements to this building. And I think that the thought was that there would be rooms that would be renovated and then could be rented out. Are there any projections on
So-
income from that?
Projections on income? No, not at this point. The plans keep changing. I come up with a plan for renovation, and then thoughts about the use for the space changes, and so then we're trying to come up. So part of that struggle has been what is the use, so that we renovate it accordingly. So as far as renovation or projections, are you talking about for this space specifically, or?
For whatever space would be renovated, so it was my understanding that other parts of the building, and maybe I've misunderstood, but I thought other parts of the building were gonna be renovated, and then there would be opportunities if people wanted to, rent those spaces
Gotcha.
out. Is that correct?
I mean, we've not really discussed rental of like specific rooms. As it is now, we do have an entity within the next month who's renting the basement for a use. And then we have some that rent the auditorium here, but that's kind of it at this point. Initially, I mean, I would love to do some renovation of some other spaces. We have some ADA concerns with some of the spaces that we could renovate and possibly have available. So that's one constraint that we have. And then, like I said, the other one is we've just got to nail down what a use is
Yeah.
at this point.
Well, it'd be great to see the building used more.
Absolutely.
But I don't
Absolutely.
know whether or not there's space at the armory, so people use that. or
Right, right,
How much space is really needed
right.
for this kind of money?
Right, understood. Yeah, some of this, though, is still just repairs that we need to make to the building. And so, yeah, it's all kind of rolled into one.
Got it.
I don't know that that helps any.
Yep.
But as far as any real revenue projections, really the only ongoing thing that we would have potential revenue for would be when we get to the point we open it up to show movies.
Okay.
And then, even then, there's some concerns due to staffing and the cost for the movies and things like that. We're gonna have to be very careful how we budget that, because as it is, you're talking about revenue streams, it would be nice, because right now we just pay to use the building. Do you know what I mean? Well, it's expenditures, and we don't really have a revenue stream for it, so.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
And then I have one other question on this page.
Mhm.
So the Masters Industrial Park sign,
Yes.
the $50,000.
Mhm.
So I wasn't clear on this whether or not the tenants in the industrial park are actually paying to have their names on the signage, or is that something that it's assumed the city's gonna pick up?
So the names on the master sign that would be out by the highway, that would be the city's, that would be on the city. Now, any signage at their location, because there's a complete signage plan for that, so that things are uniform. So those individual signs would be on the individual businesses, the cost of those.
Understood. So the sign that would be out towards the road, has there been any thought to that of the individual businesses would actually pay to have their names on the sign?
We haven't had that discussion yet, and unfortunately, that project's been on hold since I stepped out of that role for economic development. So we have hired an economic development director, and she'll be here July 1. So that will be something that I will happily hand off and see what she does with it.
Okay, that sounds great. I will say that, in my previous experience having a business in a shopping center, we had to pay to have our
To
name
have your sign.
on the
Oh,
marquee. Yeah,
Gotcha.
the owner did not pay for that.
Gotcha.
So, great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions on this slide?
Okay.
Do you have a question, Kyle?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I was curious, I thought we had talked, like, is there any movement, and this may be just I don't know where to talk about this or what meeting to talk about this in, but is there any movement with, I know police was trying to get enhanced 911 stuff?
Yes, and that is in process. We don't have any payments
Okay.
until, I think we're 4 years out. That's on the capital improvement plan. But
Okay,
we're either
that's-
3 or 4 years out. So this is only this coming
Yeah,
years.
I understand
Right.
that, okay.
So that's-
I was
yeah.
just curious if there was anything, if that had been lost, or if
Nope.
that was something that we. Okay,
Definitely in process.
Cool,
So, okay. All right, we ready?
yeah.
Okay, this next slide just details the pre-existing leases and debts that are paid out of this fund.
Out of the capital improvement
Yes,
fund?
out of the capital improvement fund, yes. Any question on any of the leases or debts? Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is just a summary page of the revenues and expenditures. So for the current fiscal year, we anticipate ending with a surplus of $241,000. And then for the fiscal year '26 draft budget, with the projects listed on the previous slide, we are looking at a surplus of $43,000 to end the year. And the next several slides are the details within each category for this fund. So any questions? Basically, it's the same projects that we just looked at, it's just in a different format. I think it's like 5 slides down. No.
I have one more.
Yep, go ahead.
It's a general question about the budget in totality. So when I'm looking at this, I'm seeing things like beginning fund balance, and then sometimes you see use of prior year funds. I would assume that some of these funds, with the sales taxes and everything coming in, have just a general like a revenue from a prior year or something like that? Or are all those, at the beginning fund balances, are all those categorized as prior year funds? Is that what that is? So like,
Right, all the prior year funds are just for this current year, we're ending a surplus of $240,000 because some of the projects weren't done.
Yeah.
So that's gonna carry
that goes to
over.
prior year. I
Yes,
can
that's
yeah.
prior
understand
year
that.
funds.
So it's just
I
been
guess,
built
like-
over the past several years.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, you're
cut you
fine.
off. I guess my generalized question is, when I see beginning fund balances of these things, is that all, and that was at the beginning of the budget as well, like the projected balances of it, are
Right.
those all the technical, like, prior year funds that we have? Or are there
I mean,
different
each fund
categories?
has their own
Yeah.
prior fund
Is that
balance.
separate from the total fund balance that they have? Is there a separate categorization in there? Is that, I know that's a weird question.
Okay, so when you think of each fund,
Yeah.
not every fund, but the major funds, general fund, capital improvements, think of the utility funds, they're gonna have, when you think of each of those, they have 3 funds for
Okay.
each of those. You have your operating fund,
Okay.
you have your reserve fund,
Yep.
you have your repair and replacement fund. So
Yes.
all of that, each of those categories has all 3 of those, okay?
Okay.
And so they have those funds. In your operating, though, that's gonna be where your prior year balance is, right? But they all have
Well,
prior
they
year
all
balances.
have prior, yeah.
Yeah, if we don't spend everything in that year, whatever remains becomes prior year balance.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
there's-
accumulative over time.
Yeah, so there, like, I guess my question is there a place in this where we can see what the prior year funds are for each of the
That was
different
the first
funds.
Yeah, the
slide.
very
That-
first
That's
slide.
the first
Yeah.
slide. Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I was looking at, where it says
Yeah, the very first slide that lists all
yeah,
of
the
the
draft
funds.
budget, where it
Yes.
has like the fund and then it has the projected
Yes.
balances.
Yes.
So the projected balances are the technical prior year funds. There's
Correct.
no splitting of those into any
Correct.
other things. That was my major question. I was just,
So 13 million
Right.
yeah, so we have,
total.
yeah, so there's 13 or 12, 9, whatever.
Right.
Of prior year funds
Right.
that have.
And so we're
Right.
looking at starting this next budget year with roughly 13, 12.9.
Yeah.
And we're looking at ending that next budget year, if everything goes according to plan, with about 13 million,
Right.
just barely over,
Yeah,
so.
okay, that was my question. I thought that's what that was, but
Gotcha.
I was seeing like fund balances,
Right.
and I wasn't sure if that is a
Yeah.
technical prior year.
Yeah,
fund
that was that, like I
balances
said,
or
that
whatever.
first slide,
That's what
the slide with
I
the two
kinda
font.
figured it was, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
I just wanted some clarification. Thank you.
You bet. All right, anything specific on capital improvement that we wanna look at details on?
No.
No.
Not for me.
Okay. So, how many slides? did
5.
you think? 5?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so moving on to the cemetery fund. The notable changes, as I already said, we have decided to split the full-time position with the street department during slow periods. Again, is primarily during the winter months. This employee will assist with street department duties to maximize efficiency and make better use of available staffing. And that's the main changes on this budget. So if we go next slide. So this is the summary page. The source of revenue comes from grave openings and purchases of burial plots. These revenues are not sufficient to cover all expenses, so therefore a transfer from the general fund is required to balance the budget. We expect to end the current fiscal year with a surplus of $1,500. Then looking at the draft budget, this includes a transfer from the general fund of $90,000. The draft budget is balanced, showing neither a surplus nor a deficit. Any question about the cemetery fund?
No, thank you.
I think one more.
One more.
Okay, I went ahead and put the cemetery endowment fund on here. There's not any real activity on here, but everyone always wants to know what the balance is in the cemetery endowment fund. This is a restricted fund that must be used for the preservation, care, upkeep, and adornment of the cemetery. The only activity in this fund is bank interest. So,
And just to state, because you can see the fund balances, it looks at proposed ending at just over 1,700,000. This isn't one we can touch. So it's an endowment fund. Yeah, it's not something that we can dip into for operations.
okay, the airport fund. So this, the airport board has not seen or approved their budget yet, so all of this is in contingent to their approval. Revenues come from hangar rental fees, grant funds, and sale of fuel. For the current fiscal year, we expect to end the budget year with a surplus of $2,500. For the fiscal year 26 draft budget, we will not have any grant revenues or expenditures. There is currently a deficit of $25,000 at this time, so the airport board will need to decide to cut expenses or choose to use some of their balance from prior year. Okay, any questions on the airport fund? Good. Okay. The next few slides are just the details within the airport fund. Okay, Okay, economic development. The notable changes in this fund, the revenues and expenditures have decreased due to a grant project being completed. So that you'll see those reductions. So the next slide. Okay, so this fund is funded through grants revenues, and we will receive a contribution from the IDA board that will go towards the salary of the personnel. These revenues are not sufficient to cover all expenses, therefore a transfer from the general fund is required to balance this budget. For the current fiscal year, this fund is projected to end with a surplus of approximately $200,000. This surplus is due to the receipt of grant revenues during the year for expenses that were incurred in the prior fiscal year. And then additionally, the surplus was further impacted by the personnel position remaining vacant throughout the year. And then for the fiscal '26 budget, we have a balanced budget showing neither a surplus or a deficit. So any questions on economic development? Okay, the next two slides are just the details within that fund. Okay, we can move on to the utility funds, the last three funds. Okay, looking at the electric fund, there's a lot of changes in here. So the notable changes that I will point out are the sales of electric projections decreased slightly. We consistently see a decline in electric usage. Also on the purchase of power, that's an expense line. This is what the city pays to MPUA to provide power to us. We decreased it significantly, $192,000. I way over budgeted in the current fiscal year. So I just, looked back over the past several years, and so I went ahead and reduced that to a more better number. This expense is volatile to what the weather is going to be, so it could always fluctuate up or down. So any questions on any of these items that I've got listed? Okay, so the next is their capital improvement. These items were on their capital improvement plan. I didn't notice until it was too late, but it is missing one item on this slide. It's missing the pole bunks, which were for $15,000. And then the total of all the capital improvements come to $666,000. So anyone want to discuss any of these projects that we have planned? The change from the meeting on Tuesday, if anyone was listening or present, we did change the bucket truck from $60,000 to $300,000 so that we can buy it outright versus leasing.
And a quick note, the tree trimming that's listed on here, so we do have a couple of guys who do tree trimming who are on the electric crew, but this tree trimming is bringing in the contractor who's doing the feeder line clearing. So that's supposed to be starting up, should have started up this week. So that's, a little bit different type of tree clearing for us. So that's what that 150 is for, 150,000.
Okay, next slide. Okay, just a note, the utility committee has not seen or approved the electric fund budget yet, so all of this is a contingent to their approval. For the current fiscal year, we are projecting to end the year with a surplus of $482,000. For the fiscal '26 draft budget, we are showing a deficit of $300,000. This is due to the bucket truck that we added. So the utility committee will need to review again and determine if they want us to do that or if they want to use prior year funds to pay for the truck. And then the next several slides are the details within each category for the electric fund. So if anyone has any questions. Good. Okay.
No questions, thank you.
This is the electric DNR fund. DNR stands for depreciation and replacement. This fund is used to set aside funds for future vehicle replacements and capital improvements. Most of the capital improvement purchases are paid out of this fund, so the funds are moved from the electric operations fund to this fund to purchase these items. Okay, moving on to the water fund. The notable changes, we have the proposed increase in rates recommended by the utility committee. And that's the notable changes that I have. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, and my apologies, I have the wrong slide here, and it's correct in your packet, but it's wrong here. This is the electric fund, it should be the water fund. And Kyle, I believe I gave you a copy of that.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah. So if anyone wants to discuss any of the projects that's in the capital fund for the water projects. Yeah, one of the large,
They won't match,
sorry.
David.
yeah,
They won't match what's on the screen, David. What's on the screen is the wrong slide.
Yeah.
What's in your packet is correct.
yeah. So we have a big, large project was to rehab the water towers, 450,000, you'll see in your packet. That's the large expenditure for this coming budget year, and was the main cause for the rate increase that we proposed. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the water summary. For the current fiscal year, we are projecting to end the fiscal year with a surplus of $122,000. For the draft budget, we have budgeted to end with a surplus of $142,000. And then the next several slides are the details within the water fund, if anyone has any questions. No? Three. One more. Okay, and this is the water DNR fund. This fund is used to set aside funds for future vehicle replacements and capital improvements. Again, most of the capital improvement purchases are paid out of this fund along with grant projects. Funds are moved out of the water operations fund to this fund for these purchases. For the fiscal '26 draft budget, it has been recommended by the utility committee to use $326,000 of prior year's fund balance to help pay for the capital improvements. With the use of these funds, there will be neither a surplus or deficit. Okay, moving on to the sewer fund. The notable changes are the sewer receipts have increased due to proposed increase in rates recommended by the utility committee. The next slide. So these are the projects that were on the capital improvement plan. So if anybody has any questions about those.
Not for me.
Okay, then the sewer summary slide. We are projecting to end this fiscal year with a surplus of $16,000. For the fiscal year '26 draft budget, we will end with a surplus of $39,000. The next several slides are the details within each category of the sewer fund. So if anyone has any questions on the sewer fund. Three. Five. Try five. I know, it's always wrong. There you go. Okay, so this is the sewer DNR fund. Again, it is used to set aside funds for vehicle replacements and capital improvements. Some of the capital improvement purchases are paid out of this fund along with grant projects. Funds are moved from the sewer operations fund to purchase these capital improvement projects. For the fiscal '26 draft budget, we have a surplus of $139,000. Okay. And then finally, the last slide. So this is just a slide that shows all the city's current debt for fiscal year '25, '26. So you see that's all the payments. So the next to the last slide column there is for this budget year. That's all the payments that will come out as far as debt payments. And then the very last column shows the balance of the city's debt going forward, which is about $12 million.
And so the reason for that increase is the SRF, the bond that will,
Mm-hmm.
yes, for phase 2B, the sewer plant.
Yes, the last item there is almost 2.5 million that was added from last year. That's all I have. So if you have any questions about any of it?
You guys have for us.
Thank you for all your help.
Thank you.
Anybody have any more questions, any thoughts?
Thoughts for the committee, I think, just for us in general, and it really is under the utility stuff, but it comes under us for finances, the DNR funds, that we have, we're pulling from prior year stuff and we're not replacing those, really those should be ongoing, or,
Yep.
in a perfect world, it should be a flat thing that we already have for budget
But-
purposes, since we just started funding.
Right, last year was the first year for us to
Yeah.
set up those funds and start funding them. So we
Yeah.
started from almost zero in
Yeah.
many instances.
Yeah, no, I understand that, it's like, that's what makes replacing these lines and everything exceedingly hard
Yes,
on our budget, and it's just something that we need to consider in the future, is trying to fund those
right.
correctly, and pushing myself and the utility committee to try to,
Right, and
fund those
it's
in
a
some
tough,
way.
I mean, it's a tough conversation to have, it is.
yeah, I mean,
So-
like, when you look at, like, the things that we're trying to do, like, I did some research, and just in terms of utility, I'm going a little bit too far into this, I think, but like, you should be replacing like a water tower refurbishing a water tower every 15, 20, 30 years or something like that. We have like, what,
More
four?
often than that.
Yeah, and we have 4 of them,
Right,
and at $3 million per,
right,
it's gonna be almost impossible unless we start building them now to try to get the next one.
right. And ideally, that would be happening. Now, I will say with the sewer,
Yeah,
with the SRF funding, that is a requirement that we have a fund just for the replacement of the sewer plant.
yeah, I think it's,
And that be funded and be part of the rates every year. So, like I said, that's a requirement of that funding. So, but you're right. And that's why, we kind of moved in that direction of setting up these repair and replacement funds. Rather than taking out debt every time we need a new piece of equipment, let's see if we can't kind of change that future trajectory for the city.
yeah.
So, we won't be able to do it 100%. Debt
Yeah.
will always be something that we use as a tool, but if we can minimize that, yeah.
I was just looking, we're losing on 2 of the 3
Yes,
this year, and
Yeah.
we can't do that.
right, consistently, yes,
Right.
yeah.
So it's just something I noticed. I don't know if there's any funds I don't think there's any transfers, since those are restricted funds to each of those departments, are they not?
The DNR funds?
The DNR funds?
No.
Okay, so those are unrestricted funds, so depending on where we pull from, something else can technically go into those DNR funds.
I mean,
You
the-
don't want to do that, I understand. You
Yeah,
want them to pay
I
for
mean,
each other, but-
ideally though, so each utility is restricted, and certainly sewer,
Yeah,
by both, like I said, SRF guidelines,
Yeah,
as well
state.
as our own code. We can't use sewer funds for anything else.
yeah, I understand that, but,
But within the fund, so within the 3 sewer funds, so if, just as an example, if we did this in general fund, we pulled from prior year fund balance to fully fund the reserve account last year. So we could do that with any of the utility funds. If we have a prior fund balance, we could pull from that to fund the repair and the replacement or the reserve fund for that entity, or that activity, how's that? I'm
Right.
not sure what to call it. So we can do that. I mean, that's really the only kind of transfers, is that getting at what you're talking about, Kyle? Okay,
You're just wanting us to maybe start taking a look at a mechanism for funding those DNR,
it'd be nice.
is that what? so
What I
understood
talked
you were
about
saying at
earlier?
the very beginning?
well, mainly the reserve accounts.
Okay.
So, like I said, I pointed out the sewer fund, that our reserve account, we spent down because of the flooding that happened in November, and it flooded the plant. Those repairs, like I said, we hope we get reimbursed by FEMA, and if we do, that's great, but it's not a guarantee. But if something should happen that we don't get reimbursed and we spend it down to $20,000, what is our plan to replenish that fund?
Sure.
Because if we stay at 5%, which is kind of what our fund says, our policy says now, it's gonna take us 5 years to fund that thing. Well, it may not be 5 years before the next thing happens, and so that's the
Yeah.
only
Okay,
reason I
that
think.
makes it more clear for me. Okay.
Yeah, emergency funds, I think we have a good policy,
Right.
centered around, and keeping those funded is good.
Yes.
Right, but if
The
we have to
thing that I'm
replace
worried
it,
about, and the thing that you hear more and more of, is there, people, talking about infrastructure and trying to replace infrastructure.
Yes.
We already know, we've heard about, water leaks that we have and how much you're supposed to replace on that. Right now, we don't have a DNR fund, essentially.
right,
Eventually
yeah,
what you're
right now, our DNR funds, our depreciation and replacement funds are pretty
Pretty
much
much rock
just vehicles and equipment.
Yeah,
They're not infrastructure right now.
yeah,
And we're struggling to fully fund for vehicles and equipment, so,
yeah.
yeah.
Trying to
In
fund
the
for
perfect world,
infrastructure.
yes, we'd be able to have a replacement fund just for the infrastructure, but it's just not there right now, so.
Do we know any, like, I know grants are one thing for infrastructure projects and everything else.
When
you
they're
get.
available and.
When they're available, they're not guaranteed,
Right.
you'd rather have it
Right.
be able to fund it itself.
But I mean,
And I know
if,
we're already on,
if you can do that, if you can get the grants, that's really the best bang for the buck. It
Yeah.
stretches our dollars the farthest,
Yeah.
so.
okay. I just wanna make a general comment that us in the city should probably look into trying to fund those harder if we can. I don't know how yet, but we should brainstorm on that.
Right.
Since this is a workshop, I think it's a good time to bring it up. I think that's the highest one that we're lacking in, because infrastructure is the huge,
Right.
the huge capital that we
Right.
have.
Yeah, the other one is buildings and facilities.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a tough one as well, because you can't just, hope that it'll stay good forever. I mean, buildings need new roofs, they need HVAC systems, they need, just,
Updates in general.
yeah. Did you have something, a question, David?
I was gonna just suggest there, in industry, we used an accrual account like that based on the capital cost of the project and the useful life of that capital.
Right,
So if it, say, had a useful life of 12 years, every year you would set aside 8.5% of
Right.
that cost in an accrual account, so that next time it came up, you had the cost of the original, and then you still had a little delta there because of inflation.
right.
But then that's the sort of thing that you had to make up, but
that's-
at least you had a base number to work from,
That's what
yeah.
we're trying to do with the vehicles and equipment. And we have an entirely separate spreadsheet where we have plotted out every vehicle and piece of equipment that the city has. And yes, how many years to replacement, and then we're trying to set aside every year that amount. We just struggle to have that much every year to set aside. So that's where we're at. So we're trying to follow that methodology, we're just, like I said, not quite there.
And they are real costs, and they
Yes.
are going to be incurred.
Yes,
So, yeah, we do
Absolutely.
have to face them, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we're trying to, the hard part is, since we just started trying last year, the things that we have to replace today, we don't have that money sitting there for. So that's, you end up kind of behind the curve, so, we're working on it.
Overall, well documented,
Thank you.
all the assumptions were there, it was well explained, and easy to follow.
Good,
And
thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank
appreciate
you,
the
Stacy.
Thank you very
Appreciate
much.
that a lot.
Yes, so Stacy puts in a ton of time on this. She does the bulk of tonight's presentation. But yes, thank you.
Thanks for posting it online too, so anybody can see.
Yep,
Right.
Not just
absolutely,
to us.
absolutely. Any other thoughts, questions?
Just thank you.
Okay, so we will need to look at another date. I don't know if you guys want to set that yet. We do have a little bit of an issue coming up, that we have multiple aldermen who will be unavailable the first couple weeks of June. So that means holding some committee meetings will have to wait till the last half of June. So some of the boards that still need to review their portions of the budget won't be able to until late in the month. So that puts us in a kind of a crunch the last 2 weeks of June. The Capital Improvement Committee last night wanted to set the date of the 17th.
It was that Tuesday.
Yeah, as their next meeting. Unfortunately, we won't have all of the other meetings in yet, because we're looking at moving utility committee meeting off a week. I sent that email out this afternoon. And, we still have airport board meeting to fit in those last couple weeks. I think park board, we should be able to have the first part of the month. That won't be dependent on missing board members. But just kind of giving you guys a heads up. Like I said, that it's gonna be really tight those last couple weeks. So I don't know if you wanna look at a date, you wanna wait till maybe I can send an email out when we have those other committee meetings set, so we can maybe have the meeting after all of those?
I
That would
think
be
that's the
helpful.
best way to do it.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Then we will definitely send out, as soon as we know when those other meeting dates are. Like I said, I sent out a couple different emails this afternoon trying to, hey, does this date look good for you guys?
I'll make
So-
myself available. Because
Okay,
of
yeah,
my,
when you're back, you better.
Yeah, when
be-
I'm back, I'll make sure I'm available at any
Okay.
time, so.
Appreciate it. All right, well, I think that's all we have. Do you have anything else, Stacy? No? Okay,
That's it. Well, let's adjourn.
thank you all.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.